Darcie. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats and I'm here to talk about some books. This is going to be a wrap-up for 3 months, the months of March, April, and May, during which I read only 4 books, 2 for March, 1 for April, 1 for May. I was moving to the new apartment in May and I was prepping for that, in the lead up to that move. And so that is some of why the reading is slow, and some of the reading is slow is just because, I am still in this pandemic funk with my reading, and I am not reading much. I also have some family stuff going on right now, so I've been a little absent from both YouTube and social media. We'll see how that goes. Everything is unpredictable. But the first book that I want to talk about that I read in March was an excellent novella that is now nominated for a Hugo Award, and that is The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi. This is very small, and you would not know exactly why it is that small given the back of the book. This is such an excellent little exercise in novella structure that also delivers some big themes, with a punch. I don't normally actually read the back copy of books ever, on this channel, but I am going to do that here because I want to make a point about this, because the description on the back of this book is accurate, but it doesn't, I think, give you any idea of what to expect from the reading experience. So I'm going to read it to you, and then as the main focus of my wrap-up on this book, I'm going to tell you why I think that description of this book is right and also why it is wrong. It says, "A young royal from the far north is sent south for a political marriage in an empire reminiscent of imperial China. Her brothers are dead, her armies and their war mammoths long defeated and caged behind their borders. Alone and sometimes reviled, she must choose her allies carefully. Rabbit, a handmaiden sold by her parents to the palace for the lack of 5 baskets of dye, befriends the emperor's lonely new wife and gets more than she bargained for. At once feminist high fantasy and an indictment of monarchy, this evocative debut follows the rise of Empress Nghi, who has few resources and fewer friends. She's a northern daughter in a mage-made summer exile, but she will bend history to her will and bring down her enemies piece by piece." That sounds incredible, of course, and it is, I'm pretty sure, the description for the 800-page fantasy epic, the entire story of which is folded up and tucked inside this tiny book, but it is not this. This could have absolutely been written as that 800-page epic, and yet it obviously isn't. The framing device of this story is about a cleric named Chi, that's spelled C-H-I-H, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Chi is from this order of basically historians, and they are traveling to this basically this residence where for a period of her life the Empress Nghi was imprisoned by the emperor with the handmaiden Rabbit. This is just after the death of the Empress, and so I think the idea is that the magic wards around this area have finally come down, and so they and their companion, who is this magical talking hoopoe named Almost Brilliant, are heading to this place to record the history of whatever can be found at that place. And when they get there, they find that there's an old woman who has already arrived before them, and that is Rabbit. So over the course of the time that they spend at this residence with Rabbit, basically going through the things there, the stuff left behind, and trying to piece together a story out of it, we, the readers, come to learn the story of the life of the Empress Nghi. And each chapter is prefaced by a piece of an inventory list of what the items are that they find there, and the chapter following ties a bit to the story of those items and how they related to the life of Inyo and Rabbit. So what this ends up being is a story about historiography. It's about what story is told by whom and why and what gets remembered and for what reasons. This sort of scratched my stories about stories itch. That's a thing that I really like. I think stories about history or about the making of history are slightly different from stories about fictional stories, but it's tangentially related. I will say though that because this was presented differently in the cover copy, I was a little thrown at the beginning by the discrepancy between what I felt I was promised and what I was getting, which is why I wanted to do this. Because I felt like I was promised this like triumphant fantasy revenge plot, and then you throw me in at the point where the Empress in question is already dead. And then I'm like, dang, is this gonna be a downer? I didn't want a downer. And I do want to reassure anyone who is worried about that, you do absolutely get that triumph from the way this is all pulled together in the end. So yes, I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars, and I am looking forward to reading the next book in this series, which is When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, which I believe is also about the cleric Chi. And I think that is going to be the through line of this series going forward, because I think there is a 3rd book announced at least, is that they're all about this non-binary wandering cleric from the secretive order of historians. You would think that might, you know, merit a reference on the back, but apparently not. The second book I read in March was Elatsoe by Darcie Littlebadger. This is a nominee for the YA Lodestar Award. It is a contemporary fantasy novel. I think one of the things that really appealed to me about this right off the bat was the contemporary fantasy world building that's done in this. It feels very natural, very normal, full of normal people doing normal things, but all of this magic is accepted as just part of normal life. And there's different sorts of magic associated with like different cultures and different parts of the world. Like there are vampires, there is some fae stuff, and like everyone's pretty chill about it because this is just how things are. And our protagonist, teenage Elatsoe, who goes by Ellie, is Lipan Apache, and she has a type of magic that is taught through her family line, through her matrilineal family line from mother to daughter. So it's not like a genetically inherited magic, it's a skill that is passed down through the family. And it is a ghost summoning ability, specifically summoning the ghosts of animals from the underworld, because you could theoretically do this with humans, but you really should not because it doesn't work the same way. If you summon the ghost of a human, they come back not themselves, they are evil, they are something else, something much more malicious. But Ellie and her family, tracing back to her legendary, heroic 6th great-grandmother, have been able to do this, summoning both animals that were pets in life, like Ellie's ghost dog Kirby, and also other sorts of animals, including like extinct animals from the prehistoric past. So there's some very cool stuff with the extinct animals side of things. But what happens is that Ellie's cousin suddenly and tragically dies. She gets like a premonition when this is going to happen. And then as he's dying, he comes to her in a dream and tells her that he has been murdered and the identity of the murderer. What is so nice and refreshing about this, one of the things that is so nice and refreshing about this, is that it's really nice in a contemporary YA urban fantasy type story for there to be a family dynamic where the parents understand what's going on magically with the protagonist who is their child and are supportive by and large. Ellie doesn't have to hide from her family that magical things are happening to her. She doesn't have to hide that she knows the identity of the murderer. Her parents believe her. They believe that the murderer is this Abe Allerton guy who is a doctor who turns out to be this like super influential, very rich guy in this town that they go to that turns out to be like this very strange town where something weird is definitely happening. And the question is, will they be able to get any hard evidence in order to accuse and convict him in order to get justice, because this guy probably has the police in his pocket. And it's not that there isn't some conflict between, you know, parents and child in terms of what is a reasonable level of risk for Ellie to be taking in this situation, but it's all within a context of way more communication and support than I saw in a lot of the YA fantasy books I read growing up. Also things I wouldn't have seen in YA fantasy books when I was a teenager. Obviously the Indigenous representation and the way that ends up playing into the story. This is also in some ways a book about history and stories. There is a through line of these sort of stories that we get in this book about Ellie's 6th great-grandmother and what was happening to her people in her time, told through this sort of almost mythic lens of her being this figure that looms large in the family history. The chapter heading illustrations, which are illustrated by Rovina Kai, who also did the cover, the chapter heading illustrations are all scenes from 6th Great's life as opposed to Ellie's, and I think that's a really interesting choice. And then the other thing that was lovely to see in this is that Ellie is an asexual protagonist, and it's just not a big deal. It's not a main focus of the plot at all, but it does come up. It's on the page. Also, her best friend is a guy, and there is like no romantic tension going on at all there. It is just totally okay for the female protagonist to have a best friend who's a guy, and that's just fine. All of this was just so nice to read. I also gave this book 4 stars. Where it loses points for me is the spooky stuff. Especially towards the end, it does get creepy in a way that I didn't find particularly pleasant to read. There was nothing that was like viscerally bad for me, but you know, there's vampires and ghosts and creepy death stuff. It's a big part of the plot, and the finale is quite explosive with all of that. Moving on, the one book I read in April was a book I read for a readathon that I otherwise did quite badly on. That was the second round of the Women Write Classic SFF readathon hosted by Maya from Maya Reads. I didn't ever even post my TBR for that readathon because I filmed it and then the readathon started and I still hadn't edited and uploaded it, and I was like, I'll still edit and upload this, and then a little while in it became clear that I just wasn't doing well at the readathon, so I didn't bother going back and uploading the TBR belatedly. But there were some options for different challenges for that readathon, and the one I had chosen was to read 3 SFF books by women all from the same decade, and I chose the 90s because I have a bunch of fantasy by women from the 90s on my TBR shelves. These, in my new filming location, these are my TBR shelves, and these are my Red Books shelves. And I just have a ton of 90s fantasy that I've had on my TBR shelves for ages and never gotten around to reading that should be higher priority for me than those books usually end up being. The only one I read was The Thief by Meghan Whalen Turner, and this is actually my only 5-star read of the year so far. I know, scary, right? Strictly speaking, this is a reread. I read this when I was a kid, and I think I was a little too young for it when I read it, because this, to me, is pretty clearly a YA novel, and that's how this series is published these days. Not in terms of content, there's no like super mature content in here, but back when I read this edition, which was really marketed as a kid's book, and I think I just didn't have the level of reading comprehension to appreciate what this book does, to appreciate the craft of this story. Most of the time I was reading this, I was actually thinking this is like in firm, solid 4-star territory. But then I got to the end, and the end of this book is one of those endings where it sort of changes everything you thought you know, but all of the little things that maybe didn't make sense up until that point suddenly make perfect sense. And I can see why my childhood mind reading this book might have just blanked out that entire part of the story, because if you haven't been picking up on and like storing away in your mind some of the clues, the ending isn't going to be rewarding. For those of you who've read this, which is probably many of you, the part of this that I remembered most clearly when I got to it on this reread was the part with like the temple in the river and everything that happens there, and then nothing in the whole rest of the book after that rang any bells for me. I just apparently had no memory of any of it. So once I finished reading this, I put a good deal of thought into how I might talk about it on BookTube without giving spoilers. I'm gonna have a stab at it. This is about a character who is a thief. His name is Jen. His age is never explicitly given in the text, but it's safe to assume he's a teenager, I think. It's written in first person, he's the narrator, and at the beginning of this book, he is in prison, having very publicly boasted about his skills as a thief, and having subsequently been caught for a high-profile theft. And he is dragged out of prison by a government official who's like a court scholar to go on this mission to steal a sort of mythic artifact for politics reasons. This mission needs a skilled thief, and he's gonna be it. They are joined on this mission by a couple of youngsters from the nobility, and also like a bodyguard warrior type. So this is the group of 5 people that set off on this quest. The setting of this is very sort of archetypal medieval European fantasy kingdom-ish, except that it's pretty distinctly Mediterranean, as opposed to, say, British or whatever else in the inspiration for the setting. There are, I think, 3 kingdoms that are specifically relevant to the plot, and 2 religions, both of which are clearly inspired by the classical Greek and Roman pantheons, but take their inspiration from that in different ways. There is very, very little magic in this. There isn't any magic until quite a ways in, and when it shows up, it is mythic in nature. It has to do with the gods and divine intervention in events. It's not about like humans wielding magic or there being a magic system or anything. And I like all of that about this a lot. I think the world building is really skillfully done. It never bangs you on the head with any of it, but you slowly learn these little bits about the politics and the history and the stories of this world, so that it's a book that can kind of hit the ground running and then fill you in as it goes. And there's clearly a lot of groundwork laid in this book for sequels set in this world that I am very much looking forward to reading. The thing that is a little bit frustrating early on, before you realize there's absolutely a reason for it, is the fact that it takes a long time for you to get much of a sense of the main character, because you really know practically nothing about him and his backstory and his motivations from early on, and you slowly get these hints and these bits of information. And that is unusual for a first-person narrative, especially in YA, where you tend to have protagonists where right at the beginning you're told an awful lot about like who this person is and where they come from in life and what they want. Whereas this book is, I think, fairly obviously intentionally withholding a lot of that information from you. I can be at times very, very skeptical of the usefulness in general of withholding information from the reader that the point of view characters obviously know, for the purpose of later reveals, when it's done very obviously and without a whole ton of cause. If the reveal isn't worth it, it feels like bad writing to me. But it is, I think, a fairly standard narrative convention of the heist genre, which does rely on twists and reveals. And I would, at least in some regards, categorize this loosely as a heist book. Don't let anyone convince you that Leigh Bardugo invented the YA fantasy heist. Leigh Bardugo actually has like a little note in the bonus content in the back of this book about how much she loves this book. So clearly this is one of those books that has been around long enough and has been influential enough that it's clearly inspired a lot of YA fantasy authors who have come after. So I gave The Thief 5 stars. I'm really looking forward to continuing on with the series whenever I have time to do that. I read this in like the first 2 days of the Readathon, and then I was in a book hangover and I couldn't convince myself to read either of the other 2 books on my TBR. I did eventually pick up Dark Lord of Dirkholm by Diana Wynne Jones, and I was really struggling with it. I was struggling through it for the whole rest of the Readathon, and I was only about halfway done with it when the Readathon ended, and I've set it aside for now. I will come back and finish that book probably at some point. But right now it's sort of a soft DNF. I'm not actively working my way through that anymore. And I really couldn't pinpoint what wasn't working for me about that book, except that my mind was still on this one and I couldn't move on. And then I didn't manage to finish anything else until the next month, May, when I finished reading all the Murmuring Bones, which I think I had actually started reading back in March. This is by A.G. Slatter, which is a new pen name for Angela Slatter. This is set in the same universe as her Sourdough collections, and also, I believe, the novella of Sorrow and Such. I had read some of her short fiction set in this world before. Some of those stories are included in the collection A Feast of Sorrows, which was published in the US, so it's easier to get your hands on if you're here. So I've read a smattering of the pre-existing fiction set in this world, but this is the first novel. It was also my first pre-order of the year, and the first book I ended up reading that was published in 2021. All of the fiction set in this world is pretty dark fantasy. I gave this 4 stars. I really liked it. It didn't blow me away, but it is a fairly spooky book, so 4 stars is pretty good. This is a standalone, dark, fairy tale-ish fantasy about a girl named Meghan, who is the last direct descendant of this extremely creepy, messed up family. The O'Malleys have some sort of magical connection or bargain with the Mer, which are the merfolk, that has given them power and prosperity over the years. They have always been aloof and mysterious and frighteningly inbred, and the first chapter gives this very atmospherically told history of the O'Malleys. But now they are in decline. The fortunes are diminished, there are not very many of them left, and at the beginning of the book, teenage Meghan, who has been raised by her grandparents in this crumbling estate, is left sort of alone with her grandmother after the death of her grandfather, and her grandmother starts planning on how she is going to use Meghan to restore the family fortunes. Meghan's mother married someone that the family didn't approve of, and Meghan has been told since she was a young child that her parents are both dead, but she starts to question how much of what she knows about her family is true. There's also like a book of family stories about the Mer and other folkloric magical sea creature types that may be full of secret truths depending on whether you believe those stories or not. Eventually things go very badly and she has to flee in order to avoid a marriage to her creepy cousin. Some of the pull quotes for this book describe it as being gothic in nature. I think that definitely applies to like 2/3 of the story. There is the creepy household and family dynamic at the beginning, and then there is another creepy household and family dynamic at the end. In the middle, though, there is this vast chunk that is like travel journey fantasy. Is there a word for that? I feel like there must be a word for that. But it's definitely like girl on the run, on the road type of adventure. I did pick up, as this went along, references to some of the other stories in this universe that I have read, and I'm sure there were references to a bunch of others that I haven't read. It doesn't really matter when you're reading this. You mostly just get the sense that this is a world that has a lot of local lore, and it definitely feels very rich with all of this dark fairy tale magic, which I really like. I do want to address a little bit the fact that I've seen sort of marketing comparisons comparing this book to, say, Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik and The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. I do want to briefly address what I think is correct about that and what I think is incorrect about that in order to set, reader expectations correctly. This definitely shares the young female protagonist in a brutal and cruel, historically influenced fairy tale folklore world thing going on. I think the main difference for me is that I don't think All the Murmuring Bones has the YA crossover appeal that those other books do. And I think the YA crossover appeal is part of what has led to those books' extreme popularity. So people who like that about those books may be disappointed if they dive into this expecting the same. And I actually spent a lot of time thinking about why I didn't feel like this had YA crossover appeal, even though the protagonist is a teenager. And I think that's in part because the protagonist, Mirren, is not an idealist in any way, nor does she become one. She is a survivor from beginning to end, and that is her triumph. It is purely that she survives, nothing more. And I think people who gravitate towards YA books do tend to seek something more aspirational, or perhaps inspirational. I'm not quite sure what word I'm looking for. Mirren isn't like a super cool badass girl in any way, but she does kill when necessary. There's nothing glamorous about it. It's just difficult and messy and frightening. And then she doesn't lose too much sleep over it afterwards. She is smart. She is cunning because she has to be. She is an interesting protagonist, but no, I just don't see this having the YA crossover appeal that Spinning Silver or The Bear and the Nightingale have, despite it having a teenage protagonist. So I gave this 4 stars. Totally recommend if this is the type of spooky book you're looking for, or if you've read Slater's other stories set in this universe and you know what to expect. The writing is really lovely. It's very atmospheric, and I do find the way that Slater treats complicated female characters trying to survive in, a harsh fantasy setting to be very compelling. She sort of embraces the morally gray in a way that feels very particular to her writing. So that's it. That's my 4-book wrap-up, 3 of which I have physical copies of for 3 months. Let me know if you've read any of these and what you think. Let me know if you're planning to read any of these or you're intrigued by them. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.